Okay, this is part two of the International Monetary System. So, the International Monetary Fund has 10 different regimes that they use to categorize exchange rate arrangements. So, again, these are countries themselves using the tools they have at their disposal. In the modern world, that's typically mostly arranged through central banking and government fiscal policy to set up a system of participating in their country specific or currency specific role of participating in the international monetary system, and that these arrangements can take one of 10 forms, and it's really kind of a spectrum with some exceptions. So, and so on the extreme end, you have countries that have no separate legal tender. So, in Ecuador, for example, the official currency of the country is American dollars. So you would pay tax in American dollars and transact in American dollars, and so that so basically it's just a willful non-participation in the international monetary system and relying on another currency's exchange rate regime to handle it. And this can be really valuable in countries where there's been a historical challenge of the government to effectively manage its currency. And so if, for example, if past governments had a tendency to overspend for populism reasons and accrue debt that then necessitated devaluing the currency to support, they would lose credibility. The currency itself would lose credibility. This is a story that's played out many times. And so by literally not having one, it takes away the ability of the government to engage in that kind of behavior. And that can be a stabilizing effect. But obviously that means that if there's stability issues in the adopted currency country, or if they choose to devalue for debt monetization reasons, that would negatively affect. So it's not without downside, but there are examples of countries that have made this arrangement, and so it's one of the 10 possible ways, or I guess categories of ways that the IMF bins people into, countries into. Another approach is a currency board, right? So this is a local currency which is fully backed by a foreign currency at a fixed exchange rate. So you can say, okay, well, we have, so in Bulgaria, they have a local Bulgarian currency, but they are very, very strict about maintaining a very tight exchange rate regime with the euro specifically. So not a basket of currencies, not a set of commodities, but the euro. And so if you have Bulgarian currency, you for the most part, for most of the time, can treat them as if you have euros. Now, obviously, if you're holding Bulgarian currency and they abandon this policy, then you're out of luck. But they have a long history of keeping to the policy, and so it means that, right, as long as you have a reputation for upholding that policy, there's not a very large difference between transacting in the local Bulgarian currency and transacting in euros, even though you're not actually part of the, you don't have the euro as a currency officially. Sort of in practice, it's very, very close, right? And that also means that, let's imagine that Bulgaria got into had a financial crisis or a debt crisis and was looking to monetize their debt using the Bulgarian currency. Well, they wouldn't be able to do that effectively because it would make their currency depart from the committed exchange rate with the euro, and which they have a commitment not to do. And so it sort of puts you in the same situation as having a foreign currency for your currency, where you don't have monetary policy flexibility, which is a disadvantage sometimes, but is an advantage the other times, especially if there's a history of abuse or mismanagement. So the currency board is the most extreme form of a fixed exchange rate regime. A conventional peg is less extreme, and so it's shooting for the currency to trade at a fixed exchange rate to a currency or another basket of currency. So you can imagine, you could try to trade at a fixed exchange rate with the dollar or with the euro or with the trade weighted average of the dollar and the euro, or maybe the renminbi and the yen, or some aspect of that, right? So it's and when you have a peg, then it's supported with central bank transactions, and so that peg can be attacked. So if you have a peg that's out of line with the natural exchange rate, let's imagine that, for example, you are, so if you have, say, the British pound, and it's pegged to a broader basket of currencies, and the pound is overvalued in that fixed, that pegged exchange rate. Well, then it's an outside actor could borrow a bunch of pounds sterling and sell them, and that would put downward pressure on the pound, and so the central bank would be forced to purchase pounds to support the peg. But that would mean in practice that the central bank is buying its own currency at a price above what it's truly worth. And so a well-financed and shrewd trader could do this over and over and over again until the central bank, so the central bank would have to spend actual, value to support the peg. And if they ever ran out of value, didn't have resources enough to support the peg and had to abandon it, then all of those short loans that trader took on they could then pay them back with now much cheaper pounds, right? If they borrowed pounds and sold it and bought a basket of other currencies, and then the pound falls, then that basket of currency could then buy those pounds back at a cheaper price and pocket the difference. So that's what Soros did, and made $1 billion in a day. And it got the British to abandon their pound by picking on it, abandoning their peg by picking on it. So, but again, the goal of the peg is through transactions to maintain a stable exchange rate. So that's a peg. And then, so if you look at an exchange rate graph of the peg, and we'll look at some, you can see it's just basically a line, right? Whereas, so less fixed than a peg is a stabilized arrangement. So stabilized arrangement where you have some amount of float. So you say, okay, we want to keep it within 2% for 6 months. But then obviously when you hit up against the 2%, then it becomes more peg-like, but then it could wander away again. So the currency is allowed to freely wiggle, but within a trading range, and so that allows some information about the relative value of the currency to be expressed through prices, but it minimizes the risk, right? So if I am participating in international trade and I am in a position where I need to hold a lot of Nigerian currency, if they have successfully been able to maintain their stabilized arrangement, that doesn't mean that I would have a risk-free experience holding Nigerian currency, but that the damage would be minimized to, I guess 4%, right? If depending on where you bought, right? So if you bought in the high end of the trading range and then it moved to the low end of the trading range, that could be, up to, I guess, 4%. That would be kind of a pretty unusual scenario, right? More likely would be 1 or 2. And so, there's still risk there to holding the Nigerian currency, but that risk is capped, or it's sort of a known maximum to the degree that the stabilization holds. And so, obviously, a peg is more effective at facilitating trade because instead of having, this 2% wiggle room and subjecting, people transacting in your currency to exchange risk, you're getting rid of the exchange risk. But with the stabilized arrangement, the fact that there's some movement of the price means it's easier to defend. So to some degree, a stabilized arrangement is more plausible or believable for the long term than a peg. And so that could mean actually ultimately it can be, considered lower risk for the long term because it's easier to defend. Whereas with a peg, because you're strictly keeping to an exact exchange rate, that has a tendency to break more often. So conventional peg stabilized. So a crawling peg is like a peg, but there's a planned change in the exchange rate. So you can, assume that, so I guess you can think about it in terms of inflation. Maybe you say, well, where our currency will be worth 8% less relative to the euro every year in perpetuity or something. And then the government and the central bank work to keep the value of the currency in that range. So you have, so then it would drift over time, but drift in a predictable way. And that actually could work in practice about as well as a peg. Think about it this way, right? If I have a currency that has a 1% interest rate, and I'm swapping into a currency that's pegged to it that has a 2% interest rate, I know exactly how much I'm losing if that peg is maintained, right? If the peg stays, then I know I'm giving up 1%, right? And over 1% a year over some time frame, right? If I have a crawling peg, so in this case, in my example, right, I'm giving up 8% a year, which would be a lot, but the interest rates in the crawling peg country might be 10% versus 2% in the pegged currency. And so, right, I'm giving up 8% a year in currency value, but I'm gaining 8% a year in interest rate, and it ends up being neutral. So as long as the interest rates are, if end up being matched closely to the crawling rate, it can in practice look fairly similar to holders of the currency. Now, interest rates don't just automatically arrange themselves in exactly that way, but there is a lot of pressure for them to arrange in that way, because if you have a crawling peg, let's imagine that the interest rate is 15% bigger and I have a crawling peg. Well, I could sell the one currency, buy the one with the 15% interest rate, lose the 8% annual exchange, and swap back and have, a pretty nice profit, assuming they could maintain the crawling peg. So it's tough to maintain a huge interest rate differential because there's big profits to be made trading into the currency that is maintaining the crawling peg. So a big difference in interest rates post crawling peg would be a market expressed disbelief in the sustainability of the crawling peg. And so then in that case, right, you would be taking on risk, but it would be the risk that the peg is abandoned. It's sort of crisis risk instead of some other kind of risk. But right, absence of that, you would expect the crawling peg country's interest rates to be to approximately track that difference for trading profit reasons. The next is a crawl-like arrangement. So this is a crawling peg, but there's the trading. So it's sort of the flexibility of a stabilized arrangement layered onto a crawling peg instead of a stable peg. So you can say, oh well, right in the previous example would be okay. This country will depreciate relative to the euro 8% per year, plus or minus 2% over some period, right? And then so that way you sort of are in the same position where you have a predictable amount of exchange rate change, and then that would flow naturally into interest rate expectations and make things all work out to be a fairly low risk environment. The next one is a pegged exchange rate with horizontal bands. So value of the currency is maintained within a certain margin of fluctuation, and so right there's the value fluctuates within the band, and that fixed central rate is set, and so that's really, I guess, relative to the other, to the crawl-like arrangement and the stabilized arrangement. I think just maybe implies a more hands-off approach to currency exchanges within the band, and so you have more flex there, more movement, I guess, relative to what you would see in a crawl-like arrangement or a stabilized arrangement. Another IMF category is other managed arrangement, and it's really for things that don't fit in the category. So I'm most familiar with China. So China for a long time they claimed that they didn't peg their currency, but in practice it was pegged to the dollar at some, I think it was like 6.8 or something like that for a long time, and then they just unilaterally shifted to a basket of currencies, which included the euro for some time. But I don't think this was ever officially acknowledged, but it was obvious in practice, because if you looked at the actual exchange rates, it would be completely flat, and then there was drift, and then it was flat. And so China in particular has this interesting regime where they will peg or not peg, or peg to a basket and then peg to a different basket, and it's sort of, they do it strategically, and I think sort of depending. I mean, obviously the United States is a huge trade partner with China. I mean, many countries are trade partners with China, but the U.S. is China's probably most important trading partner, and so having fixed exchange rates with the U.S. dollar it serves their strategic interest for their exporters. It makes a lot of their economic activity a lot more predictable. But I think they want to maintain the strategic flexibility of not having to commit to that all the time. In particular, right, for a long time, when the Chinese economy was growing rapidly, it meant that their currency would naturally appreciate and sort of prevent the relative appreciation of their currency. The Chinese central bank was in effect forced to purchase large amount of U.S. treasuries, and so that gets to be kind of an awkward strategic point where so the United States wants to run big deficits, and they issue a bunch of government debt, which naturally causes our currency to decline in value. And then the Chinese bank buys up those securities to undo that effect. And so then you can sort of play an awkward game of chicken where the U.S. says, oh, I'm just going to spend more money then, and then the Chinese bank has to buy more, and so that sort of means we end up getting to run big deficits without having to necessarily pay the economic consequences for that. Although, obviously recently that has all changed, but for a long time you can argue that was sort of what was going on. So, that's, I guess, again, speaking to the challenge of maintaining, pegged or stabilized currencies in the midst of global economics that are constantly shifting, right? Even if your country is economically uninteresting and growing at a stable, steady rate, other countries are crashing or booming, and all of this is relative, right? So if another country's current economy is booming, often it means their currency is also booming, and that means relative, the stable country is declining relative to a basket of foreign currencies that includes the booming country. So everything's always in flux, unless it's managed otherwise. There are the last two categories are floating and free floating, and they both, they both have the feature that the exchange rate is largely market determined. The key difference here is that a free floating is kind of a status you earn after you've shown a commitment over 6 months of not having disorderly market conditions around the currency. And so, because you can imagine a currency that's floating, but then there's lots of special exceptions where there are central bank interventions in the currency that happen frequently. And so you can say, well, it's floating, but in practice, if the central bank shows up and fixes things every 3 to 6 weeks, it's not really floating. Whereas, if it's at most 3 business days out of 6 months, or I guess 3 instances of 3 business days or less out of 6 months, then that's pretty hands off. And so the IMF would describe those countries as having a truly free floating exchange instead of an aspirationally free floating exchange rate. And there are lots of free floating exchanges, and that's, why we can, right? It makes sense to talk about, the yen being up and the Canadian dollar being down and that kind of thing, right? The ups and downs of global currencies make sense in a free floating exchange rate environment. So into the mix, we have cryptocurrency. So, this is a relatively recent innovation. I think in the last, right? I think the Bitcoin protocol went live in something like 2009. So you have, I guess in terms of a taxonomy, we could think about most nations' currencies as being fiat currency, where the currency is created by the government, put into circulation by the government, and the intrinsic value of the currency is the things that the government demands you use it for. Right? To some degree, you can say a lot of the dollar is the U.S. currency. To some degree, because you have to pay sales, you have to collect sales taxes in dollars, you have to pay income taxes in dollars, you have to pay property taxes in dollars, and so it would be basically really inconvenient if if I had a grocery store and I posted prices in some other currency, right? I could just post prices in yen and make people pay in yen, but then, I would need to convert the yen to dollars to pay sales tax and convert the yen to dollars to pay all the other tax they have to pay. So the fact that the government itself transacts in its own currency really sort of solves a chicken and egg problem for what people use to transact. And so having the government itself transact in its own currency creates a built-in demand that supports the use of the currency. If you go back in the United States, we didn't have a centralized currency in the same way. I mean, right, if you go to, I mean, there are periods where, like in New York City, if you wanted a haircut, you would, give, if you were a butcher, you would give coupons for free steaks to your barber, and the barber would give coupons for free haircuts to the cobbler, and the cobbler had a supply of, free, buggy repair from that, so people, basically everyone was becoming their own currency creator and exchanging, sort of doing certificate oriented barter. That we'd sort of pass through phases. There'd be a banking panic, and then you sort of devolve into this barter economy temporarily until some kind of surrogate currency would come back. But the states had their own currencies, and actually it was a big issue in Andrew Jackson in his presidency. There was a great deal of frustration because federal lands were being purchased with state dollars that were relatively less strong than their face value, right? It's basically, you could say, oh, well, I have Wisconsin dollars, which are really good, and Wisconsin dollars are really worth $1.40 relative to Kentucky dollars, and so I'm going to take my Wisconsin dollars, buy more Kentucky dollars, but the federal government was selling land for, whatever, $87 an acre or whatever it was. And then, so if you paid with Kentucky dollars, it was effectively on sale. So that meant that the federal government was collecting the worst of all the state currencies at all times because it was the smartest way to transact with the federal government. And so Andrew Jackson made an executive order and said, nope, you can only buy federal land with physical gold. And it caused, a third of the banks to fail and caused a huge banking panic. But you can imagine the, sort of the frustration. So anyway, so we've had, so these currencies can kind of just be created out of nothing. And, but they're, supported and managed by governments. Typically, that's the fiat version. So cryptocurrencies work differently in that there's often an open source protocol that will that dictates how many there are and how they transact, and then transactions are done on typically a blockchain technology. So in practice, this sort of starts as like a collectible. You can think of, well, Beanie Babies sort of feel like this without, Beanie Babies don't have nice technology for transferring them around, but other than that, you just created something that people can want to have or not. But number one, because they're branded as a currency, and number two, because they're baked in with exchange technology, it means in practice that cryptocurrencies could be utilized as currency. A lot of things could be, but there's a lot of potential for cryptocurrencies to be used as currency. At the moment, that's not really true. So in 2024, we don't really transact much with cryptocurrency. It's more like a collectible that you buy in the hopes that it appreciates, or maybe as a hedge against inflation, just like stamps or gold coins would be. But the technology is there for it to take on a greater role in exchange. But outside of illicit activities, there's not a lot of cryptocurrency transactions relative to fiat currency transactions going on. Separately, central bank digital currencies are being explored. So this would be a digital currency, but issued by a central bank instead of by a decentralized open source entity. And this is sort of under consideration and might go that way, but so you can kind of think about these sort of three broad categories. And why talk about it? Because it's not clear which way this is all going to go. I'd certainly say from the perspective of wealth management, if you think about investing in asset classes, right? That can include commodities and stocks and bonds and the money market, right? It is absolutely true that Bitcoin and probably cryptocurrencies more broadly constitute an investable asset class that's worth at least considering in a portfolio creation context. But more along the line of a collectible and less along the line of, a unit of accounting medium exchange. The exception to that is our stable coins like Tether. So, US dollar Tether is a cryptocurrency, but it's mechanistically designed to be worth, in practice at almost all times, exactly $1. And so you can exchange Tether using cryptocurrency style exchange protocols and transact in it outside of the traditional banking system, but then have that same storage, basically piggybacking off the dollar storage of value, a stability onto a cryptocurrency. So stable coins are kind of a unique subset of all of these. Stable coins themselves are a huge so what happens, right, is when you create new US dollar Tether, it is backed by or other stable coins. They're backed by the currency themselves, right? The idea is that you mint it, and then that currency that it's representing is held in trust. And so so stable coins are something like the 9th or 10th largest owner of treasury securities right now. So and obviously this will change as time passes. So there's some movement. So El Salvador selected Bitcoin as legal tender in 2021, and the Central African Republic in 2022. So it just sort of remains to be seen what will come of this, or possibly nothing. But at the moment, the role of cryptocurrencies in the international monetary system is minor but growing. Okay, so separately, when you talk about the European monetary system, European monetary system is a zone of monetary stability, and the idea was to eventually pave the way for a European monetary union. So basically, the short version of it is, the countries getting together to say, hey, let's all make our exchange rates pretty stable relative to each other for a while, and if you can credibly do that, then you'll get to be in the club and be able to adopt the euro as your currency. But interestingly enough, there are countries that qualify to use the euro that do not, but still, so Bulgaria was mentioned earlier. There's one other one. So you have these countries that are not using the euro, but are maintaining a stability of exchange with the euro such that they could adopt the euro if they, or at least under the original arrangement. So there's of the 15 countries, of the 15 EU countries, 11 of them joined the European Monetary Union, and so the 11 countries irrevocably fixed their exchange rate to the euro, and so euro notes started circulating in 2002. So they gave up their monetary independence. So notable exceptions, the Great Britain was in the European Union, but not in the European Monetary Union. Partly that wasn't necessarily by choice. They weren't able to maintain the stable exchange rate that was required, partly because of basically attack on their currency. So that's an example. But Norway, right, have their own currency. But, and I think that has a lot to do with, they have, oil reserves and a very small population. And so it's in their economic self-interest to, have the value of those resources and their sovereign wealth fund accrue to their own currency. But, obviously 11 of the 15 plus the 2 more that stay really close to it. That's a big chunk of the European Union. And that exchange rate has drifted over time. So relative to the crisis era, the financial crisis time frame, the euro is quite a bit down, but up relative to the web 1.0 bubble times. Right, so the dollar euro exchange rate has fluctuated over time. So this is the total exchange rate, and this is the changes. You can see changes obviously are going to hover around 0, but with spikes. So monetary policy for the Eurozone is conducted by the European Central Bank, headquartered in Frankfurt. And if you think about how if you have a currency like the euro, the central bank undertakes transactions and policies that affect the exchange rate of the euro relative to other countries, but they don't affect exchange rate within the European Union, monetary union among countries that have the euro, because they are all automatically exchanging at a fixed rate because they all use the same currency, right? But the central bank itself will have things that it does to affect its exchange rate relative, for example, the dollar or the renminbi. And that can then end up at cross purposes, right? So you can have Greece in a position where they want to monetize the debt and devalue the euro, and Germany being in a position where they want to have a strong euro to have cheap imports. And so having just one currency for the whole European Monetary Union means that their monetary policy can't be tailored to the individual states, but that also then enforces some discipline as well. But it makes transacting within the EU much easier. It makes euros a really attractive currency to hold as a reserve currency. It naturally leads to more political affinity within Europe. So there's lots of benefits, with the loss of independence being the key downside. So intra-Eurozone trade accounts for about 60% of foreign trade for the Eurozone countries. So, so within the Eurozone, so 60, if I pick a random Eurozone country and I think about my imports, well, 60% of my imports are going to be, on average, from countries within the monetary union. And so, I don't have foreign currency risk for 60% of my transactions. So that's a big boon to operating economically within the European Union. And then the relative importance of asymmetric shocks has decreased relative to the importance of common shocks. So again, when you have a big economic area, the shocks in small places will have a smaller effect. But if it was concentrated in a local currency, it might have been quite a bit bigger. So it sort of acts as a hedge a little bit in that way. Your monetary policy itself, and I guess the international monetary system is really throughout history dependent a lot on crises and panics. So especially in the United States, not so much during this time frame, but if you go back to the the 1800s, banking panics were very common and you have large swaths of the banking sector going defunct. And even as late as the 80s, we had the savings and loans crisis. And so you have, when we have debt crises at banks or bank runs, that can also often lead to currency crises, which can have contagion. Again, if you think about, right, if the U.S. has a banking panic and it causes a bunch of American banks to fail, that creates, a big economic recession, which means there's a lot less American economic activity, which means the reason to hold dollars declines and causes declines in the value of the dollar. And so if I'm a Mexican bank holding dollars in my bank as reserves, now my reserves are impaired in quality, and I might have to call in loans or sell off valuable assets to reshore my balance sheet. So that these things have a tendency to cause contagion, especially within local neighbors who transact with each other a lot, right? So looking at these different crises, they often sort of fit this pattern. So for example, in 1994, the Mexican government announced a plan to devalue the peso by 14% relative to the dollar. And again, the dollar would be an important exchange rate for Mexico as so much trade happens across the U.S.-Mexican border. Well, the plan was for 14, but it, ultimately ended up being as much as 40%. And ended up, and this was basically the end of a of a peg-like arrangement and the start of the free float. So with the massive collapse of the peso relative to the dollar, that that caused a sell-off of Mexican pesos, but also other Latin American and Asian currencies, and so that crisis sort of spread to other countries in the mid-90s. So here's that exchange rate. You can see this is what a peg or close to a peg looks like. You have a very, very stable exchange rate, and then a dramatic departure, and then lots of variability after that. So the peso crisis is unique in that it's the first serious international financial crisis touched off by a cross-border flight of capital, right? So if you have capital moving from one country to another country, causing a crisis, that again, so this can matter a lot. And we, from our, in our modern perspective, we come from we think a lot about globalization, right? And that all these financial systems are globally integrated. But that historically wasn't true. In fact, even in the United States, I mean, if you go back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, even local banking in the United States wasn't globally integrated or even like nationally integrated. You could have banking sectors like in California that are doing well, while Rust Belt banking is doing poorly, and interest rates and mortgages are low in one and high in another, and banks could fail in one place, and that wouldn't cause problems in other places, and that has been decreasingly less true over time. And so the peso crisis really was the first time where we saw it, happening across international boundaries, and a lot of it had to do with Mexico depending on foreign portfolio capital to finance economic development, right? So you can think about, right, if I need to build a factory, one thing I could do is I could, use domestic savings to then invest into factory construction. But another way to do it would be to attract foreign direct investment. So so those foreign nations would sell their currency, buy pesos, use the pesos to hire local laborers and firms to do local infrastructure development. But then if, in the event of a currency devaluation, that is not dramatically terrible for Mexican firms, but it is very terrible for foreign firms holding pesos. So then, if there's a sudden devaluation of the peso, then a whole bunch of international firms and financiers reconsider their plans to do direct investment in Mexico. And so then they sell their peso holdings, right, in response, thinking that it's not actually safe to be heavily invested in pesos at any given moment, because when you transact them back upon completion of your investment, you don't, and you're down 40% relative to what you thought you were going to get. And so that's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so that wouldn't happen with domestic savings, because the locals, if their currency is devalued, they are still transacting in pesos the entire time. So there's no trend, like if you have your local currency, buy pesos, transact, and then go back to your local currency, there's a translation loss that can happen in the event of a currency devaluation. But if you're a domestic Mexican firm, you don't face any of that risk because there's no translation, right? So if they would have encouraged more domestic saving, that would have reduced the risk, which then may have prevented the crisis in the first place. The Asian currency crisis is quite a bit bigger. It really was pretty significant at the time. So much of Southeast Asia is very economically integrated at this point. And so when the Thai baht, which had been fixed, suddenly devalued, it touched off a flight of capital. And when you think about it, if you've got a whole bunch of countries that are all pegged and somebody abandons the peg, then it's going to immediately make everyone worry about their peg getting abandoned. So if let's imagine, so let's say the Thai baht is suddenly devalued. Well, what if I'm not holding the Thai baht? What if I'm holding, a different local currency, like, so what if I'm, let's see, so you can see an example. So the Indonesian rupiah, right? So if I'm holding rupiah, there's no reason to think that Indonesia is inherently headed towards devaluation. However, if I sell my rupiah now, I can collect at the current pegged rate, and then if they switch over to a floating regime, I'll likely be able to buy my rupiah back at a lower rate. So the baht abandoning its peg naturally makes all the other neighboring currencies at risk for abandoning their pegs, which causes a sell-off, which can bring to pass the peg abandoning by itself. It's, again, self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is what happens. So the Thai baht peg is abandoned, and then you can see right away the rupiah peg, and then these sort of cascade, right? So then the Korean currency, 6 months later, or 5 months later, four, July to November, abandons it as well. And so you have this contagion, and that's really sort of what the concern and fear and what mattered politically at the time. So what caused, sort of what tipped us off in the first place? Again, right, when you have a peg like this, you have to have an economic system that's creating growth and stability to support the exchange rate you've pegged to, right? So economic mismanagement leading to GDP declines or to debt crises make the peg less and less plausible, and the less plausible it is, the harder it is to defend, right? So there's poor risk management and supervision in Thailand. There was free international capital flow, right? So you get a credit boom because you can borrow effectively in foreign currencies and speculate on real estate and stocks. And then, so you have foreign borrowers buying baht, transacting in the currency, and not worrying about exchange rate risk because of the peg. So then so that basically is a whole bunch of financial risk that should have been factored in that wasn't, and so that created an economic boom. But right, when you have an economic boom, then you have an appreciation of the real exchange rate. But that means exports are harder to do, right? You have this currency that's worth a lot, so it's expensive to buy goods, and so it's harder for your economy, right? So it's hard for your economy to succeed as an export economy if your currency is artificially high. And to maintain an artificially high currency, you have to have a really hot economy. And so, that makes it difficult. And then the fact that Japan's recession has lasted so long was a factor too. Basically, because of this, it's really hard, right? The incompatible trinity argument says it's very difficult, not impossible, to have at the same time a fixed exchange rate, free international flows of capital, and an independent monetary policy, right? Because if you have a fixed exchange rate and free international flows of capital, money will flow in rapidly or flow out rapidly depending on the relative, true value of the exchange. And so that would mean then, right, that if a lot of international capital is flowing into the country itself would have to carefully have a monetary policy that responds to offset that. So that would mean that the country itself does not have flexibility in its own policy. Its monetary policy would be at the whim of international fund flows, right? Or if you severely restrict fund flows, then you don't face the same sort of result because you have the exchange rate and the government can set policy, and then international flows of capital could be controlled to match whatever makes sense given the monetary policy, right? So if you had a country that wanted to devalue the currency to monetize some debt, but maintain a fixed exchange rate, well, you would have to not have free international flows because the immediate response to that kind of policy would be flight of capital, right? So you would have to not have capital flight possible from the outset, which would mean you may never get that capital in the first place. Right? The Argentinian peso crisis starts, I guess its inception is in 1991 when the Argentina linked the peso to the U.S. dollar, right? Argentina has struggled with rampant inflation for a long time. This was a measure to try to counteract that. The problem is that in the late 90s, the U.S. dollar became increasingly strong, right? This was in the Web 1.0 era, and American exceptionalism looked to be very real, and so the dollar had a lot of value, and so that hurt Argentine exports. So you have basically a protracted recession in Argentina because all the export-based businesses were struggling to compete on the global stage, and that led to political distress. So you have this peg, peso dollar for dollar, and in 2002, the peg was abandoned. And you can see within the course of 6 months, you have 300% inflation, something like that. Comes back down, goes to 200% instead of 300%, correct? Within a year, but massive inflation. So origins of the peso crisis, lack of fiscal discipline, right? If you have lots of sovereign debt and significant budget deficits, there's the desire politically to monetize that debt will always be there. And so the government not having fiscal discipline meant that maintaining the peg was less plausible politically, and a labor market inflexibility, right? Just the systemic issues with economic policy in Argentina. And I don't know if you've been following Argentine politics recently, but there's been a dramatic shift in, at least the president, the elected president in Argentina, is doing lots of very dramatic things to sort of operate in the exact opposite direction as some of these things, and has done some. There's been some pretty significant curbing of housing costs in major metros because of, policy reversals they've undertook. So it's this very sort of very globally controversial kind of thing going on. But in the context of Argentine history, it makes a lot of sense. They've just had, when I was in grad school, I had a good buddy who was from Argentina that he didn't trust the Argentinian peso, so he had all of his money deposited in dollars, but he had his dollars stored in a bank back home, and they had experienced significant inflation, and so the government announced one day that people with dollar deposits in Argentina weren't doing their part to support, the Argentinian people and their currency, and so all the dollar deposits would be converted to pesos, and that doesn't sound too terrible until you realize that the conversion was done at the official exchange rate, which was basically 5 times smaller than the black market exchange rate. And so my friend basically saw 80% of his life savings disappear in one day. So he took the 20% that was left, took it out of the Argentine bank, and said, I'll never put money in an Argentine bank again for the rest of my life. So this had very real consequences for people. So these currency prices have far-reaching and contagious effects. Other things that are important, not so much currency crisis of late, but with the ascent of the Chinese economy, of late it hasn't been as strong as it has been in the past, but the Chinese economy was growing very, very rapidly for a long time, and so that naturally puts the Chinese currency to be in a very strong position. However, the renminbi has very strict capital controls. You're not even really supposed to take physical currency out of the country. So I had an office mate that was a Chinese citizen, and at the time the renminbi had an effective peg with the dollar, and so he could take his American paycheck, convert it into renminbi, and get significantly higher interest rates at a Chinese bank, and then convert back into the dollars and end up making a couple more percent. But there's been a lot of international pressure on China to open up its currency to capital flows, and they've done some things in that direction. But and China is often facing criticism, not so much lately, but in the past, for artificially deflating the value of their currency for the purpose of keeping their imports competitive internationally. And that's obviously frustrating to other countries hoping to, say, export to China, because they are maybe trying to compete domestically with Chinese exports, or they're hoping to compete in China with Chinese domestic production, and it's a huge struggle because the Chinese people can't afford to buy foreign goods because once they translate those prices, it's too expensive. So this is sort of an ongoing thing. There was a big trade war sort of deal that happened with tariffs in the Trump presidency. So it seems like it's all calmed down a little bit, but this is sort of geopolitically probably the most interesting thing going on in terms of the international monetary system. What happens with China and the renminbi in the next 5-10 years. So you can say, right, what should China pursue a flexible exchange rate regime, or should they preserve this fixed rate regime? So that would be a good sort of thing to think about in the context of our discussion so far this chapter. So things to evaluate an international monetary system by, to maybe make that choice, right? You'd want things you want in a monetary system. So you want sufficient liquidity to support growth, of international trade, right? You want to have enough transactions happening to make it work. That's why we talk about reserve currencies, because if you have, if I'm a country with a small local currency and I'm trying to deal with another country with a small local currency, there might not be enough transaction volume for it to be practical, right? I might pay 10% of the value of my currency in transactions cost to handle it, or I might have to wait for several weeks for a buyer for my currency because it's not a common trade. But if you route through a liquid reserve currency, then it's right much easier. You would just sell your local currency to buy dollars, and then sell the dollars to buy this other currency and route through the dollar or route through the euro. And so an international monetary system that provides that liquidity is very valuable to international exchange and economic development. So a mechanism for adjustment that restores the balance of payments disequilibrium, right? And if we think about pegs or artificial stability, right, they just have a tendency over time to drift away from the stated previous regime. What's the plan to fix it? Is it allowed to drift over time? Are there limits in how much it can drift? Well, I mean, what's the mechanism for fixing this? Because in absent a mechanism, what happens is everything's fine for 30 years and then it blows up, right? And so, so that way, without, in the absence of an adjustment mechanism, then you worry about crises and eroding confidence in the system. So that concludes our Chapter 2 discussion. So thanks, and I'll see you, quote, virtually next week.